very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm really pleased to speak in this debate, the first opportunity I've had to speak in an education debate since I resigned from the shadow education brief. And while I led opposition almost a year ago in that time to government plans to open the so-called annex of a grammar school in Kent, I can't quite believe that in 2016 Britain we are seriously contemplating a return to selection at 11, given all the progress that we've made in education over the last 20 years. Before I get to the meat of this debate and why I believe that grammar schools will take the agenda which the Prime Minister says that she supports about opportunity for everybody backwards and why that's going to take it backwards, I want to say something about how we need to talk about the issue of social mobility, as my the Honourable Member for Stroud has just spoken about. Too often, social mobility is thought of in terms of plucking the one or two lucky ones out of disadvantage and taking them to the top, the so-called council house to the cabinet table journey. This understanding is actually really unhelpful when looking at the deep-seated challenges our country and education system faces and the complex policy solutions required to overcome them. Social mobility is and should be about people, starting as children, being able to make economic and social progress, unconfined by the disadvantages they begin with, achieving to their full potential. The barriers to this in Britain today are manifold. In education, as the Chair of the Education Select Committee has just said, the long tail of underachievement and the educational attainment gap between the disadvantaged and their peers, which is now widening under this government, not narrowing, should be the focus of public policy, as it has been for the last 2 decades. A concerted strategy for narrowing the skills gap and the productivity gap would boost social mobility for the many. And breaking down the social barriers in accessing opportunities and work and in life are also key. None of these fundamental and deep-rooted problems are addressed by a policy which focuses entirely on the already high attainers and, as we've already heard, the already advantaged getting a more elite education. The Prime Minister says she wants opportunity for everyone, and she says she wants, and I quote, every child to be able to get on as far as their talents and hard work would take them. These are aims with which I would agree, and I'm sure all of us in this House today would agree. However, her means are all entirely wrong. Not only would the reintroduction of grammar schools set this agenda backwards and be what the Chief Inspector of Schools describes as retrograde, but also the policies and interventions that we do know work, as my friend, the member for Leicester West, said earlier, are also going backwards under this government. So let's now look at both of these issues. Firstly, on academic selection and the reintroduction of grammar schools, let's look at the evidence which is clear and which my friend, the member for Wigan, and others have already spoken about. Internationally, countries which make greater gains for children in the bottom half of the income distribution are comprehensive, not selective. That's why the OECD has concluded that countries with selective education systems, on average, perform less well than countries with more comprehensive systems. Within England, the highest performing boroughs are comprehensive. London, for example, outperforms both selective areas and the national average when it comes to its bottom and top results at GCSE. In contrast, the attainment gap is worse than the national average in 8 out of 9 fully selective areas. I will give way to the Minister.
I'll just point out to the Honourable Lady that there are 7 London boroughs that either are fully selective or are partially selective areas.
These are figures which he will be aware of, where there are grammar schools and that are fully selective areas, and that House of Commons Library has produced for me today. In Kent and Medway, poorer children lag behind, whilst richer children move ahead, and the losses at the bottom are much larger than the gains at the top. This pattern is a feature of selective areas in England as a whole. Let's compare fully selective Kent to comprehensive London. Free school meal eligible pupils in Kent achieve just 27% 5 good GCSEs, while the national figure is 33%, and it's 45% in London. So I have to ask the government yet again, Why not focus on sharing the good practice of London rather than spreading the poorer practice of Kent? Furthermore, disadvantaged children in selective areas do worse for the rest of their lives. The practice of coaching children to pass the 11 plus in selective areas is rife, as we have already heard. That's why the proportion of disadvantaged children at grammar schools is so extremely and embarrassingly low. Just 2.6% of kids on free school meals. Overall, grammars admit 4 to 5 times as many children who went to independent and prep schools than are eligible for free school meals. That's why Lord David Willits, the former Conservative minister, has described grammar schools as an arms race of private tuition for rich parents. Any parent would understand why this is the case. Of course, most parents would want their children to go to a school full of clever children, where their social networks would be developed, where it's easier to recruit and retain teachers, and where success helps breed further success. However, the majority of their kids won't get in. But to suggest that their very existence doesn't disrupt the wider education system and outcomes for everybody else, the 80% who don't get in, is plain wrong. That's why we see today, in today's papers, school leaders in Conservative Surrey saying they are vehemently opposed to grammar schools, echoing many concerns raised by others of the impact of creaming off the brightest and the best and stigmatising the rest. We as policymakers should be leading the debate. As my friend has already said earlier, shouting from the rooftops about how great many more of today's schools are, and that in the top performing comprehensives, which take in many, many more thousands poorer children than the grammar schools, are just as good, if not better, than the best grammars. Yet they provide opportunity, stretch and good outcomes for all children, not just a few. And as I said in my opening, it's the social networks and community cohesion available to everybody that's particularly important in today's world, which comprehensives offer. I'm really proud that I went to a local comprehensive school in Manchester. In fact, it was the same school attended by my friend, the member for Wigan. But be under no illusion, just because we both have made it this far, that in the era that we both attended that school, Parswood High School, too many children were failed. We had some great teachers, but education was poorly resourced and too many were allowed to slip through the net. But I'm very proud that now my eldest child also attends that very same school. It's a truly comprehensive school with 40% of kids on free school meals and achieved its best ever results this year with 72% of children gaining 5 A to C, including English and Maths. Like many of the best comprehensives, it has a strong, gifted and talented programme, pretty much dropped by this government when they came in, and fluid streaming and setting in many subjects. This is what the best schools do, stretching all kids as they develop and creating a school-wide ethos of success and achievement. Even though education wasn't so great in my day, it mattered hugely to my peers and to kids from all backgrounds that they can socially and academically mix, raising aspirations and attainment for everybody. For the dozens of Manchester school kids that I meet every week, they can see that I went to a local comprehensive school just like them, and that they can see there's no barrier to what they can achieve. What a damning verdict of our country if we went back to an era where we told 4 in every 5 children at the age of 11 that there was a cap on their potential and it was only the grammar school kids who could get far. Across Manchester today, I could give many examples of outstanding secondary schools delivering real progress for huge numbers of disadvantaged kids, like Wright Robinson College, Trinity High School, Manchester Enterprise Academy and Whalley Range High School. The list could go on. That's why the Education Policy Institute found that overall improvements we've seen in education over the last 20 years, including the Sponsored Academy programme, has had a much more significant impact on attainment of disadvantaged children than any expansion of grammar schools could possibly have. So why is the government proposing bringing back grammar schools? I mean, we're all sitting here asking that same question when the evidence is so clear. one can only assume that this is because of ideology and not sound policy. In pursuit of this ideology, ministers have scrabbled together a pretty flimsy green paper and cherry-picked a few bits of selective, and I'm sorry for the pun, Madam Deputy Speaker, evidence. Firstly, they cling to research which shows that the tiny, tiny number of children on free school meals who get into a grammar school do better than those that don't. What a deeply dubious argument. Not only is this tiny number not comparable with the huge numbers not at grammars, but by definition, those tiny few are already high attainers at Key Stage 2. If you look at the top attainers at Key Stage 2 from all backgrounds, they do just as well at the best comprehensives as they do at grammar schools. Yes, I'm delighted to give...
That's the point I was trying to make earlier, that it's not the case. Of those level 5 children who leave primary school having achieved level 5 in the Key Stage 2 SATs, in grammar school 78% of them go on to get the EBAC. But if they go to a non-selective school, just 52% of them go on to achieve the EBAC. So they're not achieving as highly in non-selective schools as they are in selective schools.
Well, firstly, if the Minister is basing an entire huge change in education public policy on the narrow measure of modern foreign languages at GCSE, then good luck to him. And secondly, what I would say, and he knows this absolutely to be the case, is that you cannot compare a tiny, tiny number, I think it's 3,000 pupils in all grammar schools on free school meals, with the tens of thousands of high-attaining free school meals children in other schools. Of course, if you are at a school where you are one of, say, 3 or 4 children out of 700 who are on a free school meal, then the challenge for the school in achieving your education is completely different than if you are at a school like most of the schools in my constituency, where there are 70 or 80% of kids on free school meals. The challenge for those schools is significantly greater, and the Minister is not comparing like with like, and he knows it. So if you, as I say, those who aren't high achievers at 11, which are the vast majority of children who don't get that level 5, they do better in comprehensive systems than in selective systems. The government also argue that by changing the nature of the selection and somehow making getting into grammar schools tutor-proof will solve these problems, and we've already heard how difficult that is. But I beg to differ in any case. But why not, if that is the case and that is the basis on which the government are pushing forward with this policy, why not enforce the requirements to take a higher number of children on kids from free school meals on today's grammar schools? Do that first. Prove your point. Prove their point, rather, Madam Deputy Speaker, if they're so confident of their argument. And then come back to this House in 2 or 3 years' time and show us that you can narrow the gap in those selective areas. Finally, the Prime Minister's final straw in justifying this policy is that, and I quote, "It is wrong that we have a law that prevents the opening or expansion of good schools." She seems to have no irony whatsoever that her government has banned the opening of good schools by anybody else other than a free school sponsor, leading to the school place crisis and a system in utter chaos. So I almost find it depressing that we are having to rehearse these arguments when the overwhelming evidence is clear. But what's also become much clearer is the evidence base for policies and interventions that do work and that do tackle the educational attainment gap. Let's just recap what they are. Quality in the early years, as my friend has already said, a deep pool of excellent teachers, adequate resources targeted at closing the gap and giving opportunity for all. Just briefly to finish, let's look at what's happening in each of these areas under this government. In the early years, yes, we've seen more resources going in as the importance of affordable childcare gains political imperative and economic necessity. But while I welcome the focus on enabling more parents to work, the critical issue of quality early education in narrowing the gap has taken a backward step. We know that by the age of 5, the developmental gap between disadvantaged children and their peers is already very clear, equivalent to at least 15 months. Yet what we are seeing today is the opposite of what needs to happen in order to close the gap. Remarkably, in many parts of the country, after years of focus by the previous Labour government and many councils, we have some of the highest quality early years provision in some of the most deprived communities. This is the silver bullet of education, through many maintained nursery schools and free school nursery places. Yet in an attempt to deliver its pledge of 30 hours free childcare for working parents, by definition more likely to be better off, the government is prohibiting councils from investing in quality or subsidising the places for non-working parents. And there are many more reasons I could go into about why the quality of early years is going backwards. But as others have mentioned, we have a growing teacher supply crisis in this country today as well. Unless urgent action is taken to address this acute problem, any other education policy is meaningless and will fail. We all know that the kids who pay the highest price when teacher supply and therefore quality falls are the kids who are least advantaged and least able to help themselves at home. Finally, on resources, we've seen welcome increases in education budgets over the last 20 years and additional targeted interventions like the pupil premiums, which schools have been able to use to level the playing field in everything from one-to-one tuition and support to paying for uniform, music lessons and school trips for kids who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it. But with the biggest cuts to school budgets over this Parliament in a generation, around about 8%, I know from talking to heads in my own area that it's exactly this kind of support that is the thing that is going first. So any government which purports to have an interest in educational equality and social mobility must look seriously and quickly at these pressing issues. That's before we even get to technical education and skills and access to jobs. This would be an agenda that would keep any minister busy. So why, after 6 months of unnecessary distraction on the now dropped forced academisation agenda, are they creating yet another unnecessary upheaval on school structures? But this time, the support for their proposals is even narrower, the evidence base even more flimsy, and the outcomes even more divisive. It's time for the government to drop these damaging proposals, get back to the task of investing in the early years education, addressing the teacher supply crisis and stopping the harmful cuts to school budgets.